My name is Steve Zanakis. I'm a psychiatrist, former Army Brigadier General, Medical Corps officer, served on active duty for 28 years. I have a part-time clinical practice and consult with the Department of Defense and other government agencies on neuropsychiatric conditions. I do believe strongly that requiring the companies to conduct studies in accordance with a pre-market approval would put them out of business and essentially deny care to soldiers and veterans. This is unacceptable.
FDA also performed a literature search for CES studies published after the 1993 proposed rule, which included studies through mid-2010. FDA excluded many of the studies from further review because they were conducted on very specific populations that were not representative of the general population suffering from insomnia, anxiety, or depression.
First off, some of the specifics that are in the information. One question is the different patient populations and whether or not some of the research can be looked at because it's identified as being a separate patient population. Depression, anxiety, and insomnia are what's listed under the FDA language. These are not psychiatric diseases. These are symptoms. And to single out some of the research because it addresses a substance use population and the treatment of anxiety within that population is unfair in my opinion.
These opinions were generally based on firsthand experience, either as a healthcare practitioner or patient, and sometimes both. Although the comments report on the effectiveness of CES for a range of conditions and note a general lack of serious adverse events, the evidence is largely anecdotal in nature.
So this is a military service member survey and a civilian survey. The blue bar, the third bar down on these three anxiety, insomnia, and depression charts, the blue one is service members, and the one below that, the purple one, is civilian survey. And this is the people who are reporting an effective result. And it compares very favorably to drugs that you all are aware of, because these are the blockbuster major drugs used in these indications, and that comes from a WebMD ongoing survey that we accessed here in October of last year. So for anxiety, it compares well with Xanax and Ativan. For insomnia, Lunesta and Sonata, and for depression, Zoloft and Wellbutrin. It not only compares well, but in some cases a little better than these drugs. And you have a copy of this entire survey. In fact, it's on the cover of this book we gave you, and I urge you to look at this book. The FDA says, oh, don't look at that, that's just anecdotal. But that's people who use it. I don't think the FDA reviewers, whoever they might be, are using this or have ever seen a CES device. So read this. You have colonels in the Army, you have one general, and you have a priest, a chaplain, you have all kinds of people who use this who are qualified, lots of psychiatrists.
Valid scientific evidence includes well-controlled investigations, partially controlled studies, studies and trials without matched controls, case histories by qualified experts, and reports of significant human experience.
CES devices have been cleared for the indications depression, anxiety, and insomnia. It is important to note that these three conditions, depression, anxiety, and insomnia, are non-specific terms, and they may refer to either a general mental state that is not necessarily representative of pathology, a symptom which is representative of a pathological state, or a diagnosis or pathological entity in and of itself. Focusing on the last two levels of specificity, which are the most important to CES devices, indications for use for medical devices provide identification of a particular disease entity or target population and identification of an effect on clinical outcome. For example, use of medical device improves the rate of durable complete remissions with chemotherapy. Within these descriptions, it is implied that a specific disease entity or disorder is the target of the device intervention. For this reason, although depression, anxiety, and insomnia may refer to non-pathological states, symptoms of an underlying disorder, or the disorder itself, the current CES indications for use were examined as representative disorders. That is, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and primary insomnia, respectively.
The Code of Federal Regulations defines CES as the treatment of anxiety, depression, and insomnia. It doesn't say anything about any patient population, and for us, for 31 years, we have never limited it to any patient population. What for? It works across the board. There's no difference. Insomnia is ubiquitous in all patient populations. Thank you.
From a clinician standpoint, in response to your question about what types of insomnias are responding to CES treatments, as a psychiatrist, if you will classify it into initial, middle, and terminal insomnia, I see response in all three of those categories. That's one way to look at it. Another is by specific disorder type, mood disorder versus anxiety disorder versus substance use disorder. And from a mental health perspective, I have not seen a type of insomnia that did not respond to that. Obviously, an obstructive sleep apnea type of insomnia, this device isn't going to be as effective with that. But in looking at it in those two types of ways, I've definitely seen a response there. In addition, in extreme environments such as a combat zone, we're able to see. So it's not just mild insomnia, it's significant, severe. Additionally, I think on the insomnia point, when you do a treatment, as soon as the treatment's done, you're alert and you're ready to go. That's why you don't do it right before sleep, as opposed to some of our other therapeutic options, which will create windows of time, such, sleep medications, 8 to 10 hours sometimes, where you really don't want to be doing significantly intensive tasks, such as operating tanks or helicopters or probably even driving.
FDA accepts only scales with demonstrated validity and reliability as primary outcome measures for studies supporting product clearance or approval. Moreover, while many scales and measures have been tested and deemed valid and reliable, only certain instruments are typically accepted by FDA as primary outcome measures. For instance, valid and reliable externally rated measures are preferred as a primary outcome measure over unvalidated, unreliable self-report measures. Examples of accepted primary outcome measures will be discussed in the next slides.
This finding that was published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology a few years ago that said one single question on a Likert or a VAS scale, which the FDA is trying to throw out as being irrelevant, actually they threw out all of our studies for little bureaucratic technicalities. We ask you to be less biased and more objective in your analysis of truth. And so here we see a single question correlating well with the state trait anxiety index, which is the most validated test in anxiety. It's not the HAM-A, it's the STAI, Spielberger's test.
Finally, a word about study design. There are basic study design elements that should be present in any study seeking to evaluate the effectiveness of CES, including, but not limited to, a randomized trial design to ensure comparability of the active treatment and control groups with respect to known and unknown confounders, a sham control group with successful masking to minimize any placebo effect, eligibility criteria based on a specific diagnosis, a clinically relevant measure of effectiveness, adequately powered sample size, use of appropriate statistical methods, predefined success criteria, and consideration for durability of effect.
The valid scientific evidence, when taken as a whole, should provide adequate support for a determination that there is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness.
We further limited our search to randomized controlled trials, observational studies, systematic literature reviews, and meta-analyses. An initial search of the 5 electronic databases yielded 392 citations, which were reduced to 204 results when duplicate articles were removed. These results were cross-referenced with an annotated bibliography published by Daniel Kirch, who is the founder of Electromedical Products International and developer of the Alpha-Stim CES device. 87 additional articles were identified in the Kirch bibliography. This added to a total of 291 titles and abstracts, which were screened for original studies, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses, which fit into either Category 1 or Category 2 indications. In this screening process, 229 articles were excluded for reasons including non-approved use, non-journal article, non-systematic review, studies from the Kirch bibliography that were published before 1970, non-human study, treatments not specific to CES, non-English articles, and not original research, and case reports. Full texts of the remaining 62 articles were examined by two independent reviewers for inclusion, of which 23 were excluded because either no data was presented or there was no clinical application. In the end, our systematic literature review included 39 articles.
Out that 60% of the studies, especially in Category 1, were published in the 1970s. So in other words, we have a lot of old data and not much has changed since then, although additional studies have been published. FDA acknowledges that there have been numerous publications investigating the use of CES and that most have been positive. However, they all have significant limitations. Please note that the criteria that are listed on this slide were not used to further screen the 39 articles that were included in the systematic review. Based on our review, as I just mentioned, none of the studies included all of these elements. And this makes it difficult to make any favorable interpretations of effect.
Various assessment tools were used to evaluate measures of depression, anxiety, and insomnia. Listed here are some of the outcome measures used in the Category 1 studies. Some, but not all, of these measures are validated and appropriately applied assessment tools. This table presents some of the key study design features in the Category 1 RCTs and observational studies evaluating depression. For each study listed here, we examine whether or not there was a control group, the presence of successful masking to minimize placebo effects, an a priori statement of the study hypothesis, if sample size was adequate using an arbitrary cutoff of 50, use of DSM diagnostic criteria to evaluate a specific indication, use of validated and appropriately applied outcome measures, determination of a pre-specified endpoint for success, and statistical adjustment for key confounders.
I am Dr. Richard Caccarini. I'm the former director of the Division of Biometric Sciences, CDRH, FDA, and currently I'm a statistical consultant to the medical device industry. Now, unlike negative studies, positive studies that are small do not have statistical power implications. It's the other side of the curve that you're worried about, and that's type 1 error. But there are consequences of small size with regard to comparability adjustments that you might be able to do. The statistical analyses in these studies were not always complete, but appear to be representative of the journal and the year of publication.
Category 1 studies of anxiety, however, also had notable limitations in study design. One of the more well-designed studies, however, is a double-blind RCT by Phillip and colleagues. This study enrolled 21 psychiatric inpatients who had anxiety based on DSM criteria. After 5 days of receiving the assigned treatment, anxiety levels were significantly reduced compared to baseline in the active CES group, but not in the control group. Although the pre- and post-anxiety levels differed only in the CES group, the authors did not test to see if anxiety levels were significantly different between the active treatment and sham control groups after receiving their assigned treatment, which is the standard statistical method in efficacy studies. Other limitations in study design include lack of a pre-specified hypothesis, small sample size, and the absence of validated outcome measures, as well as a pre-specified endpoint for success. FDA believes the available valid scientific evidence does not demonstrate that CES will provide a reasonable assurance of effectiveness for the indication of insomnia, depression, or anxiety. The panel will be asked to comment on the adequacy of the available scientific evidence in defining a clinically accepted target population for CES and the relationship between this population and the indications for use of insomnia, depression, or anxiety. The panel will also be asked whether they agree with FDA's conclusion that the scientific evidence does not support a reasonable assurance of effectiveness for the indications for use of insomnia, depression, or anxiety. None of the studies included in our literature review met all of the criteria for a high-quality clinical study that Dr. Park previously noted in his presentation. In conclusion, the 39 papers included in our literature review reported inconsistent findings regarding the effectiveness of CES for treatment of depression, anxiety, or insomnia. However, due to key limitations in study design, the effectiveness of CES remains unclear. In the absence of demonstrated effectiveness, a key concern raised is that use of CES in lieu of proven effective therapies may present undue risk to patients whose psychiatric conditions may worsen if left untreated.
Question, not of efficacy, which you've heard a lot about today, but the issue, I think, before this panel is the question of, is there worsening of the condition being treated as a result of ineffective treatment? I think in some ways this is almost an insult to those of us who are physicians, because what do we do every day? We see a patient, we provide for them recommendations for treatment, and then if we're doing our job, we're monitoring our patients in an ongoing fashion to determine whether or not the treatments we've prescribed are effective and what potentially side effects may also be emerging as well. So it's not as if I am going to prescribe, or any of us are going to prescribe any treatments and then essentially say we're going to continue with this treatment regardless of its being ineffective. All of us, I think, attempt to strive for efficacy and monitor those side effects. The problems, I think, occur when the medications that we're prescribing are not taken by our patients, and we know the adherence rate is miserable for the psychiatric medications for anxiety, insomnia, and depression, and that patients stop them, and they often won't tell us that they've stopped them. So in essence, I think the question before this panel is, if this is going to be a device which is prescribed by a licensed practitioner, it's not the issue that the device may be ineffective. Our medications are ineffective. I mean, read the literature. It's out every single day. Or if they are effective, they have, you know, an unacceptable side effect burden. But the issue is this: are we going to monitor the patients? That's not the responsibility of the device. It's the responsibility of the clinician. And of course we monitor our patients. And if it's ineffective, we would change. We would add. We would, in some cases, as we've heard, maybe use it as an adjunctive therapy. Or we would move on to other therapies. So I think to raise this issue as a concern that perhaps this device would in some ways preclude the patients from receiving evidence-based treatments that are out there now, I don't think is valid. I don't see any clinician essentially staying with an ineffective therapy. Of course, our medications are ineffective, we know that, but we keep attempting to change the medications, change their dosages, or provide some other type of intervention. So I want to make sure that that point is well understood. Furthermore, I think with regards to the treatments that are out there, there are populations for which medications are really not indicated. We have a number of patients who may come in, for example, young mothers with infants who can't sleep. They're real concerned about taking medications that may put them to sleep, and then they would not be able to awake during the night and respond effectively to their child. They want something that doesn't have that kind of effect. Well, what else do we have? Not much.
FDA believes that there may be potential for unreasonable risk of illness or injury because the condition may worsen due to ineffective CES treatment. As Dr. Prague presented earlier, a worsening condition can manifest in several ways. There may be a greater risk of suicide, an increased likelihood of hospitalization, psychiatric and medical comorbidity, increased disability, avoidance behavior, and decreased quality of life and functionality. As I will discuss in a few slides, the indications make few distinctions about the condition, and if a patient with a more serious condition were to be treated with an ineffective device, FDA believes there may be an unreasonable risk of illness or injury. FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine, and we understand that in clinical practice, a clinician would make the judgment about whether to continue with treatment if it appears to be ineffective. However, we would also like to reiterate that the supporting data need to be provided before the device is allowed onto the market.
I would again just mention that there have been cases where things have been thought to be safe and proved not to be. Certain drugs, thalidomide, Trovan, fenformin, others that were ultimately went through all kinds of clinical trials and fulfilled all the criteria we just talked about, but when actually released and used the way patients sometimes use things, in addition to a bunch of other variable factors that we can't control, they subsequently caused fatalities and had to be pulled from the market. And everybody knew about that. So that was well published. So in contrast, here we have a product that's been out for, again, 30 years, widely used, and we haven't really read about any significant safety issues or fatalities anywhere, which would make me think that probably it's a safe product. In addition, many of the things we do in clinical practice in treating patients have not been substantiated anywhere through randomized clinical trials or anywhere else, but they're still done. They help patients, they save lives. We all do them, and we don't put them under this. The problem here, I think, is really the timing. If this was a new product and it hadn't been out, and people hadn't used it, and we didn't have so many testimonials from people who seem to me to be very credible, it would be one thing. But that's not what we have. And to try to work backwards, I think, and apply clinical trials to something that's already been out in practice, widely used, I'm not sure I understand, how that really makes sense, since the most important test is when it goes public and people actually use it.
Sympathetic to the fact that these devices have been on the market for a long time, and some people are clearly, deriving benefit from it. But the studies that are, 25 and 30 years old don't meet our 2012 sort of standards for demonstrating efficacy, and that's no one's fault, but that's just the way it is. We've got to be working as a panel, I think, in terms of, in 2012, what would we judge to be reasonable evidence of efficacy, and I don't think it's there.
To quickly conclude, FDA believes that the available scientific evidence supports a Class 3 determination for the following reasons. The available data do not support a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness due to limitations, as I've discussed. PMA review would allow for the collection of data on a defined population towards that effectiveness. Special controls proposed by the petitioners would not be sufficient to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness because they don't address the variability of the device characteristics. And third, FDA believes that adequate special controls cannot be written based on the existing evidence, and worsening of the condition due to ineffective treatment is a potentially unreasonable risk.
So the petitioners gave us quite a bit of information this morning that included sham treatments, included some fairly long-term outcome information. And I'm assuming that the information that they presented would have been among the studies that you discarded because of a lack of scientific quality. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I don't recall exactly which references
Well,
they included.
Well, I think all of it, but we saw a number of graphic descriptions here, especially bar graphs, comparing active treatment to sham. Okay, we saw that. And then we also saw information showing that the effect was durable over a long period of time. I can't remember the specific time frame. But since that information was presented this morning, I'm just trying to get a feeling as to whether those studies were felt by you could not be included in your analysis, because there is quite a discrepancy.
Right.
That's my point.
Reasonable assurance of effectiveness when it can be determined that in a significant portion of the target population, use of the device will provide clinically significant results. EPI has an abundance of well-controlled investigations amassed over 31 years of encouraging research by independent government and university investigators in the form of mechanistic studies like fMRI, Loretta, EEG, EMG, and other diagnostic tests, double-blind randomly controlled trials, and other less rigid models. This research is also supported by post-market surveillance and comprehensive, scientifically valid user surveys.
So first, let me apologize for the inflammatory nature of this question, and I'll address it to any of you. Can you name me, honestly, any currently available device or product in the United States that would stand up to the rigors that you've just listed for the device we're talking about today? I can't think of any.
Yes.
Name it.
This is not the appropriate place or forum to do so, as we can't compare.
I think the rigor that we're asking of these studies and of this device is extreme, to say the least. I think we should be considering safety separately from efficacy. I think they've demonstrated safely beyond any reasonable doubt. Efficacy, I'm not so sure of. And finally, to do a twofold thing of ignoring 30 years of history is just silly. And then to eliminate all of the available data because it is not typical in research papers to state your hypothesis, and generally that's implied by the research, and it is not typical to state a predetermined endpoint. You're just looking for statistical significance, and you will state what that is. So to eliminate papers based on that, I think, is just completely unfair.
I was thinking that as a new student of epidemiology and biostatistics, it's my impression that these types of study designs haven't been around that long, and this level of discrimination of study design is fairly new. So I think that should probably be taken into account, that maybe the FDA is expecting a higher standard.
Also, I'd like to point out too that even though the best case is this fantastic clinical study, the CFR does allow us to look at reports of significant human experience. And in our documents, we have pages of significant human experience, including generals, captains, corporals, I don't remember all the ranks, saying how the military is using this on the battlefield, in the hospitals there, as well as when they get back. That I also think speaks reams of efficacy data showing a good effect. And I agree with everyone here saying there is no safety concern. Thank you.
Question 2. As defined in 21 CFR 860.7E1, there is a reasonable assurance of effectiveness if there are clinically significant results in a significant portion of the target population when the device is used for its indications for use and conditions of use, when accompanied by adequate directions for use and warnings against unsafe use. FDA believes the available scientific evidence does not demonstrate that CES will provide a reasonable assurance of effectiveness for the indication of insomnia, depression, or anxiety. And so Part A, please comment on the adequacy of the available scientific evidence in defining a clinically accepted target population for CES and the relationship between this population and the indications for use, insomnia, depression, or anxiety. And B, Does the scientific evidence support a reasonable assurance of effectiveness for the indications for use of insomnia, depression, or anxiety?
I believe that using the full definition of valid scientific evidence from the CFR definitely provides valid scientific evidence that that it is efficacious for insomnia, depression, and anxiety, Part A, and Part B, reasonable assurance based on the presentation that the reasonable assurance, of efficacy and in a significant portion of the target population that will provide clinically significant results. Yes, I say it does.
This is one that I have a really hard time with. First, our questions say for the indication of symptoms of insomnia, depression, or anxiety. And I understand from, I think it was paragraph F that you referred to, that there's a more clear guidance about whether there's a clinical diagnosis necessary to indicate a valid target population, but that part is confusing to me. And as a person with a mood disorder, I would have to say that I'm very aware that the same symptoms that I have are shared by many people in the population at various times. And as a patient representative, I have to question whether the target population needs to be defined by a clinical diagnosis, or if it's acceptable to say symptoms of depression, insomnia, and anxiety without specifying a clinical population. So I'm sorry, I guess I'm confused about whether the evidence describing the target population necessary has to do with the clinical studies that are presented or the indication that we would be recommending classification for.
So if I can jump in here, I think the confusion is we're trying to say that the indications for use needs to identify a population with these disorders.
I'm sorry, one final point. I just wanted to say that in the classification of electroconvulsive therapy, there's no clinical diagnosis associated with that, it says, for depression. Well, I guess we're given two different wordings. So if the slide is the correct wording, sorry, can you put the slide on?
Right there.
I don't see a clinical diagnosis on there, so I would have to say, yes, it does provide evidence of effectiveness.
I think since we all agree that there's essentially no risk, if there was even one patient benefited, it would seem like there'd be more efficacy than risk.
Thank you to the panel for your professionalism, your concern, and your diligence in going through these studies. You know, our dictum is to do no harm, and I think you all very adequately determined that there is no harm associated with this treatment. There is obviously controversy as to the efficacy with regards to the clinical rigors that are required by the FDA, but I do think, speaking to the CFR, which was done here, the preponderance of evidence does support that there is an efficacy, and given, as we just heard, once again, the denominator with regards to risk is 0, what we're effectively doing if we categorize this as a Category 3 device is essentially denying our patients an opportunity for a treatment which may be effective when we have no other definitely effective treatments that don't also carry a high risk of side effects, and in some patients the treatments themselves make them worse, and that's what's written in the journals.
Focus my remarks to a dilemma that we as physicians encounter that is represented and captured in this hearing today. And that is how we reconcile respectively our role as scientists and our role as humanists. And what respectively our responsibilities are to what is the advancement of our disciplines and professions in the interest of our patients, and what our responsibility is to our patients who come to us not only vulnerable, but clearly suffering from the life circumstances that they have encountered. And I've attempted today to illustrate to you that I believe that the overwhelming responsibility that we have to the welfare and quality of life of our patients far exceeds what is the confidence that we have in our scientific method. And I say that as a clinician who has soldiers and veterans and other patients come to me suffering with the problems of anxiety, depression, insomnia. And I say it as a general who sat and advised the most senior leaders in the Department of Defense and looked out to what would be the consequences of 10 years of war. And having served during the Vietnam War and watched my colleagues and fellow soldiers who then went out for years and suffered with their PTSD that took our profession a while to establish and validate as a diagnosis. It took our profession a while to recognize the effects of Agent Orange. When we have groups of patients, less than 50%, who are satisfied with the treatments that we are providing, do we not have a responsibility to take a reasonable risk when we acknowledge as a group that the risk for a particular treatment is infinitesimal? So that denominator magnifies what the effect is of the numerator and what the benefit will be from the treatment. And I ask you, as fellow physicians and citizens, as Americans, to consider that. We don't have 2, 3, 5, or 10 years to wait for the clear scientific evidence and compelling evidence to come out and say, yes, we're going to certify this treatment. We can do it in a smarter and more reasonable way now. Thank you. I'm glad you can indulge me. I do feel passionate about this.
I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here today and to hear our presentations. I would like to point out that there's an inherent unfairness to this procedure in that we received just yesterday the FDA's list of studies that were excluded from our presentation. And I believe if those studies were more accurately considered by this panel, that you would conclude that there is valid scientific evidence establishing that the device is both safe and effective. But obviously we did not have a time to respond to the deletions of studies for reasons which I would believe all of you would find invalid if we had time to discuss that. But when you have 45 minutes to present your device and all the science, some things are going to be left out, unfortunately. And when you have a day to prepare a response to their deletions of a lot of good research, you are going to unfortunately not have time to address it. But again, I thank you for your time because you were very thoughtful and very, very courteous and asked wonderful questions. Thank you.
I would just have to say that I am struck by the fact that the FDA is considering putting this in the classification with life-threatening or life-sustaining devices. And I feel like given what the panel has said about its estimation of the risks associated with this device, that unless the FDA believes that there's no chance of any sort of benefit, that it wouldn't make sense to categorize it in Class 3.